Hi everybody. So in this set of slides we're going to work through chapter 25. So I'm going to follow the order of the graphs that are presented in chapter 25, as well as pointing out some of the important main points of the chapter and of the market structure of monopolies. So it would help you as you go through this if you have your textbook open to chapter 25. So as you see at the beginning of the chapter, one of the key points you want to take a minute and review is just the definition of monopoly and the different types of monopoly. Keep in mind that a pure monopoly of one producer is a model. It's very rare for there to be absolutely one producer, but the other more perhaps pragmatic definition of a monopoly is one where one company controls more than 50% of the market share. So in this case, this is considered to be operating within a monopoly market structure, but it is not a pure monopoly of only one firm in the market. But it because of its market power, it can exert the power of a monopoly. The other key point, which was a question on the homework, has to do with barriers to entry. And people answered this question on the homework really well, so I think barriers to entry are pretty clear that they are what they sound like, things that stop other firms from entering the market. And there's different types of barriers to entry. But barriers to entry are key to the monopoly because it allows the monopoly to have complete control over the market. So in other words, other firms cannot enter the market. And we're going to see there's a big connection between barriers to entry and long-run profits. So what you'll see is that this relationship is really important to allowing the monopolist to have profits in the long run as well as the short run. So what we're going to start with is drawing the demand curve that a monopolist uses, and it is going to look like the regular demand curve that we know so well. Okay, so what we see here is that the demand curve that the monopolist uses is exactly what we've seen before when we studied supply and demand. Now the thing is, because in the model of monopolists, or of a monopoly, the demand curve is also the industry curve, because there is only one firm. So this demand curve looks just like the curve that we were using for the market, because the market demand curve that we see here is the same as the demand curve for the monopolist. Now, the big thing to note is that this demand curve for the monopolist is going to be different than the demand curve that we saw for firms in perfect competition. As a quick review, when we were looking at firms in perfect competition, we said their demand curve looked like that. And this is for perfect competition. This is not what the demand curve looks like for the monopolist. Okay, so just to review that again, in perfect competition, the demand curve is a straight line that we see here. However, for the monopolist, the demand curve slopes down. So what we also have to keep in mind for the demand curve is the fact that if it's a downward sloping demand curve, that the monopoly firm is still facing the law of demand, meaning that if you have a price that is very high for the product, they will have a quantity of demand that is lower than if the product is sold at a lower price, because of all of the contributions to the law of demand, such as the substitute effect and the income effect. All of those still apply to the monopolist, but the difference is that they are able to use the market demand curve as their firm's demand curve. Okay, so the other thing to keep in mind, if the demand curve is downward sloping, that also means that the marginal revenue curve must also be downward sloping. So we're going to draw in the marginal revenue curve as lying below the demand curve. And actually, there is a point where the marginal revenue curve is going to continue and actually cuts the x-axis, and your marginal revenue becomes negative because it goes below zero. But we'll come back to that later. Okay, so if we think now not about the demand curve, but how does the firm figure out how much to produce, what quantity should they be producing, and at what price do they sell it? So this connects back to things that we looked at when we were looking at theory of the firm and perfect competition, in the fact that we're going to have some curves that now look more familiar. We're going to have the average total cost curve and the marginal cost curve, right? Those still look familiar. The marginal cost curve is intersecting the average total cost curve at the low point. It looks like something that we have seen before. Now, we are going to consider now for the monopolist, how do the curves look different? And for that, we need to draw in the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. So that's what I've done. I'm showing here the demand curve, which is downward sloping, as we just talked about, and then below the demand curve lies the marginal revenue curve. It's not crucial that you show the marginal revenue curve cutting the x-axis when you're drawing cost curves. It really depends on if you're trying to emphasize that point or not. So how do we figure out now what this firm, how this firm should figure out for their quantity, or what their quantity should be? So for that, we go back to the idea of the profit maximizing point, which is profit maximization. Profit maximization takes place, if we remember, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that rule still applies. So we're going to find that point on the graph. So we look for marginal cost curve, marginal revenue curve, which we see is here. So that's going to then tell us the quantity that is the profit maximizing quantity. So that's the first way that we read the graph. That gives us the quantity of production. But what we're going to see is this point right here doesn't give us the price. The price that the monopolist can charge is set by the demand curve. So to say that again, the quantity is set at the profit maximizing point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But the price that the monopolist can charge, they have to go up to the demand curve, and that tells them the price. So if we look back at what we just said here, this part determines quantity. But for the monopolist, the demand curve sets price. Okay, so now what we're going to do is draw a demand curve for a monopoly firm that is experiencing profit. So when you're drawing these curves, I would still recommend starting with the average total cost curve, as we did before, marginal cost. And then you draw in the downward sloping demand curve. And then remember what we said was that we were going to try and show a firm that is experiencing profits. So that means that when you draw it, you want the marginal cost to be intersecting the marginal revenue curve at a price above the ATC. So we again are going to now find marginal cost and marginal revenue, set the quantity, and we go up to the demand curve to set the price. Okay, but now we want to label profits. So profits, we take the price I'm going to make a profit box now. We are taking the price to the amount that the quantity that's being produced, and then we go down to the ATC. This box right here, that represents profits. Because it is price minus the ATC. Price minus ATC. The difference between the price and the average total cost per unit at that quantity. That gives them their, this part right here, the vertical distance, is the per unit profit, and then the box that we're seeing in red is the total profit. So you see that these graphs, even though the marginal revenue curve looks different, we are really reading them the same way that we did for perfect competition. So if you felt comfortable with that, if you practice with this a little bit, it's going to feel a lot more comfortable. So on the next slide, we'll go on and show a firm that is a monopoly firm that is experiencing a loss. Okay, so I'm going to start by drawing this graph with the same curve. I'm going to start with my average total cost curve and my marginal cost curve. And now what I want to make sure is that because of the fact that I'm thinking that I want to show a loss, that means that I have to show the marginal cost and the marginal revenue curve intersecting at a quantity that will mean that the price is lying below the ATC. So I'm going to draw in now a demand curve and my marginal revenue curve. And I'm going to use the same rules that I've been using all along. I'm going to figure out what's their profit maximizing quantity of production. I'm going to use marginal cost and marginal revenue. And so that gives me this quantity. However, to figure out the price, I'm going to use the same rule that I used before, which means I'm going to go up to the demand curve, and that's going to tell me the price that that the market will support through its demand curve. But what we're seeing here with the loss is that at this quantity, the average total cost lies above the demand curve. So what we're seeing in the purple box is the loss at this unit or amount. Okay, to recap there, the page disappeared for a second. But what we're seeing in the purple is the loss that this firm is experiencing at this level of production based on the price that they can charge due to the demand curve. And for this company, it's a loss. So it's really important to keep in mind that monopolies can experience loss. Some monopolies go out of business because in the long run they can't cover their average total costs. So, or the demand changes for the product. Even though maybe there's no competition in the market, perhaps people's tastes change and they don't want what the firm has been providing. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind. So, to keep in mind, what you want to be able to do for the graphs on a monopoly is you want to be able to draw the cost curves, which show the correct demand curve and the correct marginal revenue curve. And you want to be able to show a firm that's experiencing profit and to show a firm that's experiencing loss. And at this, you could also, no, never mind. That's at this point, that's all we're going to say that you want to be able to be comfortable with. There's some other graphs that go with later in the lesson, but I'm going to do that in a separate presentation. I hope you have enjoyed this Monopoly slideshow presentation.